Look, I've covered a lot of failed live services in my channel over the years, and I'm telling you, Marathon is following this trend just beat by beat. And unless there's a major overhaul or a major change of plans, I don't foresee this game really garnering a level of success that will allow it to be a long-term live service. And this goes doubly true with some recent developments. Now, already, we have talked about the fact that the reception surrounding the game itself has not been particularly positive, with trailers and whatnot garnering mixed reviews, with hands-on experiences not being as enthusiastic as you might hope they are for a new Bungie title. You've got the fact that player retention surrounding the game has not been great, with closed alphas highlighting a pattern of diminishing players and diminishing viewership and just diminishing social media presence on major platforms like Twitch. And of course, the most recent controversy involving plagiarism has plagued the game's PR because, well, every time you look at the game, you can't help but wonder what's stolen and what isn't. And then on top of all that, you've got reports highlighting how morale at Bungie is at an all-time low or in free fall across all departments, with developers at Bungie stating to reporters that the vibes have never been worse, with concerns about what will happen to Bungie itself should Marathon bomb, and it looks like that's the direction that this is headed in. Now, something else that this Forbes article reported was that Bungie pulled the plug on its main Marathon marketing plan, which was going to have a new trailer in June. The whole campaign needs to be reworked now. Beyond that, a public beta that was supposed to happen in August may have changed into a roadmap of public playtests. So plans are in flux, and it would seem as though there's no clear direction as to when and how this game will launch, especially in light of recent developments, highlighting just a certain kind of hostility towards the game and a certain level of disdain towards the game. And that finally brings us to the latest developments surrounding Marathon and the news that seem to indicate that this game is in for quite an uphill long-term journey. It would seem as though we might not see this game this year based on more news and more affirmations that marketing surrounding this game is just not going as originally planned and maybe altogether canceled. The following information was relayed by Colin Moriarty of Sacred Symbols. Currently, this episode of his podcast where he talked about this is paywalled on Patreon, but there's one specific quote that numerous news outlets picked up on from Colin Moriarty's reporting, and he's someone who has sources in the industry and is able to get information from folks who decide that they need to speak out about behind-the-scenes goings-ons. And so right here we have a Forbes article that kind of quoted Colin Moriarty on Sacred Symbols. He had the following to say about what he heard based on his own kind of research and him speaking to sources that he has at PlayStation. So here's the exact quote that's making tons of headlines. "I was told by someone familiar with marketing plans in a key overseas market that there are now no plans to do paid marketing for a Marathon at all. I don't know if those plans were affected by what has recently happened or if that was always the plan or whatever, but it is considered a fairly unusual move for a game of this high profile." So this is the second time we're hearing, the second report that has stated that marketing plans for Marathon have been scrapped altogether and will be reworked. So what that indicates is that this game will likely be delayed. And Paul Tassi from Forbes kind of hinted at this already with his reporting. And in this reporting of Colin Moriarty's report, Paul Tassi goes on to say that that was similar to what he was told when he spoke to folks at Bungie, whereas Colin Moriarty got his information from folks within Sony. Sony and Bungie being aligned due to the fact that Sony bought out Bungie. So the fact that we're getting sources from both within the development studio and the publishing side of things all saying the same things seems to indicate that there's validity to the situation, that marketing for this game was scrapped, in part likely because of the plagiarism accusations that's forcing Bungie to essentially go through the entire game and see what was stolen and what wasn't, what was directly lifted from the original artist who exposed Bungie for plagiarism, and what stuff is actually original to Bungie. And then beyond that, there's just this general sense that nobody really is about this game. Nobody really likes this game. And then the plagiarism situation and controversy was kind of the final nail in the coffin. It was already a precarious situation, but the trust and the goodwill surrounding Marathon, a game that already wasn't appealing to a lot of people, both on the Bungie side and on the extraction shooter side, the bad will that all of this has generated has meant that people weren't even really willing to give Marathon a chance. And so all of this has culminated in a situation where most likely the game will have to be delayed in order for them to reassess how to market this game yet again, how to find ways to kind of spruce up the game in a way that will make it more appealing. And that way they have just better prospects for this title's, potential success. Though I think that even with a delay, it ultimately will not make much of a difference. I believe that the problems surrounding Marathon are on a foundational level. The plagiarism stuff, that only added fuel to the fire. But I just think that unless they make a different type of game altogether, this game really doesn't have a whole lot in terms of a chance for success. What its skeleton is that they're building everything else around, that is the thing that is just not appealing to a whole lot of people. And then you look at the art style, the one thing that people are like, that's kind of unique and appealing, and turns out that elements of that were taken from artists who did not contribute to the game and who did not give permission for Bungie to use their assets. And you've got a situation where now no aspect of the game ultimately appeals to really anyone. And I want to highlight another situation, another live service that saw myriad delays. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. This was coming from Rocksteady, a very celebrated studio, right? Who created the Batman Arkham trilogy. And this is a game that initially had some kind of hype around it, and then people learned that it was a live service. So already once people learned that, there was a whole lot of trepidation surrounding this title, and then gameplay came out for the game, and it looked just so generic, even for a live service, that people were not really giving this game a whole lot in terms of hope that it will succeed. People were kind of a little turned off by the direction that this game was taking. And so throughout the course of the development cycle of Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, tons of delays happened. The game was delayed, I believe, 3 times. And, they used that time to polish things up. But what ultimately launched was a live service that felt really kind of incomplete. They didn't really wrap up a full arc of a story because they wanted to make sure that the story lasted for many, many seasons, because they wanted to recurrently monetize players and keep them engaged. And so the campaign experience just didn't feel as satisfying as it could have. And then beyond that, despite the delays, the core of the game was what people were turned off by. The skeleton of the game was what people weren't appealed by. And despite having the DC brand behind it, despite the Justice League being in there, despite villains like Joker and Harley Quinn and, iconic characters from the DC universe being used to market this game, it ultimately ended up being an utter flop, despite the myriad delays, despite them trying to, market this game as best they could. Because ultimately, a brand and an IP and characters can't carry an entire game, especially in the live service space, this market that's so oversaturated, where if you don't stand out, like Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, where it just felt so generic in what it did and didn't really do anything better than other live services, then what you ultimately get is a situation where the game really has no chance for success. You can just sense it. You can sense a lack of enthusiasm surrounding a game like this, and it feels like Marathon is going through a similar journey. Sure, they can delay it, but Marathon is still just Marathon. It is still that extraction shooter that doesn't really get extraction shooter right, or it doesn't have the bones and the meat to make it as appealing as something like Tarkov or as Hunt Showdown, which have become sort of de facto games in this genre that Marathon is trying to break into. But based on impressions that are out there, just a lot of people don't feel like Marathon does enough to stand out. The fact that it's charging $40 and isn't free to play, combined with just a lack of substantial content and it feeling feature incomplete, and it not feeling like it does anything new or unique or anything that surpasses the established norm. Even if the Bungie name is behind Marathon, even if, the creators of Destiny are the ones shipping this. That's no guarantee of success, in the same way that you could tag a game with the Marvel brand on it, like Marvel's Avengers, and it can still flop, because if the game does not look appealing and if it's not ultimately fun to play, or if it doesn't do what other live services do but better, or just, new enough and fresh enough and executed well enough that people feel like they have to try this thing out, then, Bungie as a brand, as a studio, despite the pedigree that they have in the games industry, that name won't be enough to draw people to Marathon. And right now, really, you just can feel the general sense, both among hardcore fans of Bungie and among just your general gaming populace, that this game is just not quite it. You look at folks talking about why this game is not appealing to them and just how much it's getting in terms of interactions and upvotes. No proximity chat, no solo queue. So lacking in features that appeal to those who like to engage in multiplayer, and then lacking features for those who like to play live services in solo mode. No species of aliens that people liked from the original Marathon, no campaign, no personal customizable characters, no tension in an extraction shooter, not listening to fans. A lot of people are just calling developers, or, in particular leadership, I'd say, delusional. And that's not too far off from what developers at Bungie are saying. They're speaking to reporters to kind of say their piece about what it's like working at Bungie and working on Marathon. And even the developers don't seem to have much faith. Not only is morale in free fall, but the fact that they're almost an active rebellion by telling reporters, hey, things are not good within Bungie, with quotes like this. This is a former developer who spoke out on social media platforms like Blue Sky, saying, as a former Bungie employee who worked on Marathon, I feel for those still at the studio. Working with engineering, Marathon leadership was extremely toxic and humiliating. I won't speak about the rest, but Bungie leadership needs to be gutted completely. So that's somebody who spoke out on his own platform, but then you've got some former and or current developers at Bungie who spoke to folks like Destin from IGN, who quoted employees saying the following on his channel: everything happening to Bungie is because of greed. Bungie's problems stem from a lack of player empathy, disconnected leadership, and a corporate-first structure. Internal language shifted from studio, games, and players to company, product, and customers during the Sony acquisition. The fact that you've got folks like Paul Tassi being told by developers that feedback that was being relayed to leadership as far back as 5 years ago went unheard and often ignored, or the fact that you've got Destin being told that Bungie feels like a cool kids club where you either agreed with leadership or were put on a list, berated publicly, and told your ideas didn't matter, with one ex-employee saying if they didn't think of it, it wasn't worth doing, so on and so forth. And you've got a situation where there's just no faith at all that Bungie can pull off Marathon, make it a successful product, and that it can stand the test of time. I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on everything surrounding Marathon, what you think prospects look like for the game, and what you think the future holds for Bungie given the Marathon situation right now. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.